Hey guys, what's up? We're now in the 30-second Xamarin Android tutorial series. And in this video, guys, what we're going to be look at is passing data in between activities, okay? So in the last couple tutorials, what we saw was how to call an activity from another activity and make the transition, and then how to smoothly animate between that and make some custom animations to make our app unique. So now in this video, which is probably the most important when we're speaking about activities, how do we pass data? So we are in one activity and we're going to the other, which is a whole different class. So how do we pass any data over that we need from the activity that called it? So that's what we're going to be talking about in this video, okay? So just to give you guys an example of what's going to happen is we have the login activity like we've been working on in the last few tutorials, and we'll have a username like whatever. And when we click this, it'll pass in the data and it'll pull up the user ID, which is arbitrary right now. It's I just put it to 1. And this right here, the username that we put in, okay? So this is a really simple example of how to pass in data, okay? And I'm gonna show you two different ways to do it. One way is a little more geared towards passing in primitive data, and the other one is for passing in like user controlled objects, okay? So that being said, let's get started, okay? So now, in the first thing I want to show you is probably the most simple way to do it, okay? So we'll come over to the activity that's called. This is the login screen, okay? So remember, here is where we start our intent to call the second activity, okay? Now in the intent, what we want to do is we want to call the intent that we made, and we want to call a put extra method, okay? And notice that there's 24 different signatures for this method, okay? And let me just kind of scroll through them. Now each one takes the first parameter of a string, which is the key, and then the second one's going to take a value, which could be a byte, a char, double, float, int, and so on, okay? So that being said, what we can do here is we can just pass in something like user ID. And I'm just kind of going off the example of, say, if the user logs in, once they actually log in, maybe you go in here, you would, somewhere along here, you would query the database, and authenticate the user based on their username and password, and then return maybe a user ID, and then that user ID can then be referenced throughout the application, okay, to bring up specific data for that user or whatever. Okay, so just say it's 1. And now and you could put more than one object, okay? So say we have this is going to be a user ID, so it's going to be an integer, and we can have something that's the username, okay? And we can do something like their username is Joseph, okay? So here's a integer and here's a string, and like I said, you can do float, you can do many other things, but here's just an example of 2, okay? Now that we put extra inside of this intent, then we started the activity with that intent. On the other side of this, the activity 2 is where we can retrieve the user ID in the username based on those 2 keys, okay? So if you come back over here, now activity 2 is called. We'll go into the situation, the activity 2 has been called, okay? And what we'll do is we'll first come into the XAML that activity 2 calls, which is right here. And let's just go ahead and make another text view. Just keep it simple. Let's go into the source. And this is what's going to hold the username. And this will hold the user ID. Okay? Now, what we want to do with this username is we'll do something like we're going to have a match parent. We'll have the text color and the gravity the same, okay? And then we'll change this ID to something that's a little more specific, like user ID. This is going to be below user ID, and then this could be username. Okay, so we have these 2 holders now, okay? So now let's come back, let's go ahead and do a rebuild. And we're going to come back into the second activity, and we're going to reference those two text views, okay? All right. So just the usual way that we do that. Let's get inside the class here. And we'll call them user ID. And then we'll call this one username. Okay. And then of course the usual thing, we're going to do the find view by ID. It's going to be a text view. And we called that one user ID. And we want to do the same thing for the username. It's also a text view. Okay. So now we want to set the text of the user ID and username. Okay. So what we can now do is we can do intent, and notice that intent is a property. Okay. So let's call the intent, and it's say get string extra. Okay. So here we actually have to specify the type of object that we're calling. Okay. So remember we had a string and we had an integer. Okay. So we had an integer and a string. Okay. User ID and a username. Okay. And this is because this is an integer and this is a string. So based on what we pass it is going to be what's going to be passed back when we actually call the intent. Okay. So we'll do get string extra, and it has to be exactly the same. Okay. So it's going to be user ID, and we do have to specify right here. We'll do get string second. We'll do get int extra. Okay. And then here, we actually have to specify a default value. Okay. So if this is wrong, then it wants to know, okay, well, what should we what should be the default value? Okay. Then we'll just pass in 0. Okay. And this is because a integer is not a nullable type. Okay. So what happens is it needs a default value to default to. Okay. And this is saying that it can't make the conversion. So all we need to do is call the toString method. Okay. Now we'll do the same thing for the username, and we'll set its text, and we'll do get string extra, since a string, we're expecting a string to be passed from the username key. Okay. And we don't have to specify a default value, since if it doesn't exist, it'll default to null. Okay. So we have a username and we have a user ID. So what should happen, guys, is we call this intent. It passes in these fixed values of 1 and Joseph, and based on these keys that we can now grab from the second activity that it called, user ID, username, and then it'll pass back 1 here and Joseph here. Okay. So that's what we should expect from this, guys. And like I said, this is the first way how to pass in, and there's many other different ways, but I'm going to show you a pretty neat way to pass in something more than a string, like you have a actual class that you define yourself. Okay. So it doesn't matter what we put right here for right now. Let's go ahead and just log in. Okay. So now it pulled up and it binded the data 1 and Joseph. Okay. So that worked just as expected. But you might already be thinking, like, what if we have like a user class? Okay. So it's not, you see right here over here, you have put extra, right? And let's just pull up the parameters. And we have for a string, for a bool, and we have for an array of bools, a bundle, byte, char. So if you want to pass in something like your own object, right, that you've specified, it gets a little trickier. And there's one technique that I like to use, and it's kind of like an easy way around it, is what I like to use JSON. And what I do with that is I take the JSON and I serialize it using the library, json.net. It serializes it for me into a string, into a JSON string, and then I just grab it from there, and then then it'll deserialize it into a .NET object. Okay. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, let me go ahead and show you. So let's go ahead and just to make a clear example, let's go ahead and make a class. Okay. So say we have a user class. Okay. So we have a user class that represents a single user. Okay. So let's go ahead and make a few properties. Okay. So a user typically has like a user ID and a username and then a password, of course, and probably much else, but we'll leave it at that. Okay, so user ID, username, and password. Okay, so now we have a user class. Okay, now one way to do it is we can go ahead and when the user logs in, we'll go ahead and we'll have the ID that's passed back, right? And we'll have all this other information that's passed back from the database, like their username, maybe even their password, maybe their preferences, settings, favorites, a whole bunch of stuff that we can store for the user. So something that we can do, and let's just go ahead and first let's comment this out. So let's just say a user logs in, okay? So you want to instantiate a representation of that user, okay? So the user ID is say 1, and then you want to have a username, of course, and the username is going to be a string, and then the password is going to be, we'll just have it called password for now. Okay, so this is going to be the user that logs in. Okay, now what we could do, one way to do this now is we can take this and you can say, okay, well, we can do put extra, and what we can do is we can say, okay, user ID, just like we did before, and then we can do user.user ID, and then we can do it again for like say the password or whatever. We'll have a key called password. We'll do password. So we could just keep doing that for everything we do. But that could be one, cumbersome, and then two, what if that user inside of the user class has another object, another user-defined object that we've defined. Like say they have a favorites, and we have a favorite class that holds a user's favorites. Okay, like all of their favorite contacts or all their favorite meals if it's a meal application where you find restaurants or whatever. So you would have something like the type would be favorite, and then you would just call it fave, get set, all that. Okay, obviously favorite doesn't exist right now, but then you would have to, what if you want to pass those favorites in, and then you got to do user dot favorite dot dot first favorite dot second favorite, and then what if that favorite has an object? So it'll become really hard to do, because you're gonna have to pass in a lot of stuff once this user class gets pretty big, and it's just not ideal. Okay, so this is an example, of course, that might not be needed at first, but once your application gets larger, you're probably going to need a better way to pass in data through that and through an activity. And it would be nice if you can just pass in the whole user, everything, right? The whole user, anything you specify, the user's there. Okay, so this whole JSON object, say it comes back from the database, and then you specify it using the user, and then you serialize it and then deserialize it on the other side, right? So a better way to do it would to be just to do it once, okay? And what you do here now is you do put extra, okay? And then you're gonna put a string. So we'll just call it user for the key. And what you do is you serialize it, okay? And we've done this before. We've actually downloaded this API before, but I'm gonna go ahead and show you how to do it again. Just right-click references and go into manage NuGet packages. Okay, so I'll pull up the NuGet manager, and right here is JSON.net. Okay, so if you guys haven't used this before, it's a really great library to work with JSON strings. Okay, to serialize objects, to deserialize, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Okay, so really great library. Okay, so let's go ahead, and all you gotta do is now install this. Okay. So, and then NuGet will take care of everything else for you. Okay, so you go ahead and install it. It'll reference it for you, and everything. And then this website should come up and give you some small examples and some more about what JSON's all about and what you can use it for. Okay. So let's go ahead and close that. Now notice right here in our references, it's now been referenced for us. Okay. So because it's referenced for us, now we can include it in our application. Okay. So here it is. So now we can come into here and we can do JSON convert dot serialize object, okay? And what object we want to serialize is of course the user, okay? And this is perfect because serialize object returns a string, okay? And that's exactly what put extra wants, or one of the signatures that it takes is a string, okay? So we had to do get string extra on the other side, okay? So now it basically took this whole object and put it into an entire JSON string that represents a .NET object, okay? And we only have to do this once now, okay? So before I continue, let me go ahead and make a reference to the edit text, okay? And we can come down here, and the edit text inside the XAML, the AXML is I believe txt username, okay? So let's do a find view by ID, edit text, and resource.id, yeah, txt username, okay? So now that we have a reference to the txt username, which, just to refresh our memory, is this guy right here, what takes in the username, okay? So when the user types in something, we'll actually pass it right here. We'll pass it into the username right here. So it'll be more dynamic. Username.text. So this will make a user, pass it in, and then we can come over here, guys, and instead of getting get string extra, what we can now do, because we know a user is going to be passed back, is we'll do user, and then we'll make we'll actually make a global variable, okay? And we'll just call it m logged on user, okay? And that will equal, and once again, we're going to use the JSON library to deserialize our object now. So we'll do using newtonsoft.json. And here we'll do JSON convert. And over there we did serialize object. Now you want to deserialize the object, okay? And what we want to do is we want to pass it, it's asking for a generic, okay? And notice that whatever we pass in here will be passed back, okay? So whatever object, whatever type we pass into T, it'll pass back that same type, okay? So we want to pass in a user, right? Because a user is going to be passed back, okay? Right here. And what do we want to deserialize? Well, we want to deserialize the string that was passed from the calling activity, okay? So we'll do get string extra, and remember we called it user, okay? So now it passes back a JSON object, JSON string, and it deserializes it into an actual user.NET object, which is user, okay? So now right here, we don't have to keep doing it. We can just now we actually have a user instance, okay? So then we can do user ID to string, and then we can do m logged on user, username, okay? So this will work exactly the same way. However, once it's going to be a lot easier, because now once our user class, our user object gets really long, or any other object for that matter, gets really long and big and kind of fat, we're not going to want to pass in data the primitive way. We're going to do it some other way. And there are some more, I should say, other ways to do it that have been more accepted to pass in data, like using a parsable and other ways. But I find this way to be pretty easy, because once you have a really great library like JSON.NET, you can just serialize an object into a string and then just deserialize it on the other side. So that seems to be, it's a really convenient way for me. So just want to pass on that knowledge to you guys. And then now let's go ahead and run this app, and it should happen. What should happen is basically the same thing that happened before, but now we have that peace of mind that we're doing it efficiently, and we're coding for the long run once our application gets a lot larger, okay? So the one difference is that we're actually going to pass in whatever the user types in, okay? So just some random string of characters. And there it is, okay? So one is fixed, and then here's whatever that person passes in, okay? So autocorrect degree, and there it is, okay? So there you have it, guys. And that's there's a couple different ways to how to pass data in between activities. Okay. So that's gonna probably finish it up for activities. I might come back to them if there's anything, if there's more that needs to be done, or if you guys are commenting and there's something that we need more on activities and or need to talk about. But it's something that I definitely wanted to touch base with. Okay. So thanks for watching, guys.